Thor, a large, cordial German Shepherd, began sleeping in the snow outside his kennel. After 3 hours of observation, his owner Max decided to find out the reason for this behavior of the animal. What he found inside was absolutely impressive. Max was shocked when the dog growled at him. He raised Thor from a tiny puppy, and the two were always best friends. He approached the booth again, and the dog reacted to the owner in the same way. He stood between him and the booth, growling quietly, as if warning the owner not to come closer. The snow crunched under the man's feet as he took a step to the side. At the same moment, Thor stopped growling. "What is a friend?" he asked quietly. "What you have there?" Thor wagged his tail and lowered his head. Then he walked over to Max so he could pet him. Max decided that the conflict was over, so he took a step to the side and again headed towards the booth. But Thor stood in front of him again and took a threatening pose. Max realized that it was better to leave the dog alone, since what was in the booth was clearly important to Thor. It all started in the summer of the previous year. A man who was passionate about carpentry built a magnificent doghouse. It had a large canopy and plenty of space inside to shelter the dog from the snow that Max expected would start falling in early December. And so it happened. On the 3rd of December, the temperature dropped sharply, and the first snow fell. Thor instinctively realized that the structure built by Max was intended for him, and in a matter of minutes, he turned it into his personal fortress. That evening, the owner looked through the crack between the curtains in his bedroom and saw Thor lying on the porch of his house, resting his head on his front paws as if he was on guard. It had already been snowing lightly for about 2 hours, and Max decided to check the dog again. Thor was still on the porch of his booth. It was bitterly cold outside, but he didn't budge. It was really strange. The next morning, the man came out to the booth again. Thor jumped to his feet when he saw his master. But when Max tried to walk to the entrance to the kennel, the dog again stood in front of him just like yesterday. Then the German Shepherd looked at his owner pleadingly, as if saying, "Please don't try this again." As soon as Max made a movement towards the entrance to the booth, a quiet growl was heard. The dog tried to prevent the man from looking inside the kennel. The owner was puzzled. He had no idea what to think about Thor's strange behavior. But then he came up with a plan. He quickly walked to the door plus to the kitchen. Once inside, he took a piece of meat from the refrigerator and began to cut it into small pieces. This was Thor's favorite treat. The dog will not be able to resist a bowl of finely chopped meat. Max was sure of this. The only difficulty was convincing Thor to come to the kitchen. With a bowl in his hand, Max went outside and approached the booth. As before, Thor jumped up to greet him. The owner squatted down and played with the dog. He then took the bowl out from behind his back and gave it to Thor to smell. The dog almost jumped up for joy. Nothing delighted her more than pieces of fresh meat. But when Max walked away with the bowl and called Thor, it looked suspicious. He usually got treats at his booth, but now his owner wanted him to go to the kitchen for it. Thor was confused. He looked back at the booth and whined quietly. Then, apparently deciding that everything would be fine, he followed Max into the kitchen. The dog ran in after its owner and jumped joyfully without taking its eyes off the bowl. The first part of the man's plan was executed to perfection. He placed the bowl on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen and petted the dog again. Thor began to eat. He didn't try to eat all the meat at once like most other dogs would. Instead, he seemed to enjoy every bite. Now it's time for the second part of his plan. Max slowly stood up. He walked with his back to the door, keeping his eyes on the dog. Thor didn't pay him any attention. The man left the kitchen and closed the door behind him. The second part of the plan was successfully completed. He headed towards the booth. Thor realized the trick as soon as the kitchen door closed. The dog scratched at the door and whined pitifully. When it became clear that Max was ignoring him, he ran into the living room. There were large windows and Thor could see his booth from there. He saw the owner walking towards her, and this upset him even more. He barked louder and jumped towards the window. Max heard a noise from inside the house and turned around. There was Thor looking at him angrily. Max didn't like that he had to lure the dog into the house and lock him up. It seemed like a betrayal to his best friend, as if it would somehow destroy the trust that had been built between them since Thor was a puppy. But he just needed to see what Thor was guarding inside his booth. When he reached the kennel, Thor became furious. For a few seconds, Max was sure that Thor would break the glass and jump out through the living room window. The dog's anger seemed to grow as the man approached the entrance to the booth. Max knelt down and looked inside. Now he was completely defenseless because his head and hands could not fit through the hole at the same time. But curiosity took over. As soon as his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, he was shocked. There was a raccoon inside. For a moment, Max was confused. In a normal situation, the raccoon should have simply run away, but this one stood his ground, just like Thor. He was protecting something. Then Max saw it. At first, he noticed only one baby raccoon. Then he saw the rest. In total, he counted 6 babies. The man immediately realized that Mother Raccoon needed a safe place to give birth when the early snow began to fall. And being a gentleman, Thor sacrificed his home for her and then became a guardian. Max couldn't help but smile as he realized that Thor, a loyal and kind dog, had made a huge sacrifice for Mother Raccoon and her cubs. He shared his space and became their protector, even against his master. As the days turned into weeks, Max decided to create a cozy haven for the raccoon family nearby. He made a comfortable nest and made sure they had a safe place to live. Thor, understanding the situation, regained his booth, but always kept a vigilant eye on them and was always ready to share his shelter. It's so great to see a story about kindness between animals. Thank you, dear viewers, for listening to the end. Share your opinion in the comments and also subscribe to the channel, where you will find many more interesting things.